So we've got Lord David Frost here today, who's got a very long and incredible track record in foreign affairs. He was in the Foreign Office for a very long time as a diplomat, and then obviously the chief negotiator of the government's Brexit talks with the EU. I think you secured a deal after approximately 10 rounds of various negotiations. You became a life peer in September 2020 and a cabinet minister too, and a full cabinet member of the cabinet in March 2021, before resigning sometime after that through disagreements with the Boris Johnson administration. So I'll ask a few questions today of David, and then we'll open up to the audience. We'll be here for about 40 minutes or so. And my first question really is, 10 years on from the referendum, David, what is your verdict on Brexit?
So thank you, Doug. Thank you, everybody, for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here in such a beautiful setting. So thank you. My verdict is largely we got what we wanted. Largely we delivered the right result. There were a few things that didn't come out well. And without going fully into the detail, everybody in this room, or almost everybody, looks too young to remember the British Brexit referendum and everything that followed. But as you say, it was 10 years ago, and I think of it as kind of those 10 years are split into two halves, roughly. The first 5 years were spent leaving, and that was much more complicated than we thought. The Theresa May government, which was the first government after the referendum, got a few things wrong, which are in the final agreements. But overall, I would give ourselves 8 out of 10 for that kind of period. The 5 years after was all in our hands. We'd left the EU. We were, with the exception of Northern Ireland, we're no longer constrained by EU policy making, EU laws, EU ways of doing things. And the view of those involved in leaving the EU was that this was the opportunity to do things different. There was no point in becoming an independent democracy if we then chose to do exactly the same things as the EU, just outside the EU. And we have begun that process of doing things differently, not as fast as I would have wanted. There hasn't been as much economic change under the Conservative government that followed, and there is not. Some of that is now being reversed under the Labour government. So I think it all depends how you view these things. Britain has become a country where you can settle things at elections. General elections can change policy completely in a way that they can't in EU countries. What you vote for is what you get now in Britain, and I think that's healthy for a democracy. Have we brought in enough economic change? Have we got the country going again as we hoped? Well, no, not as we hoped, but it's in our hands. We can now change things. We can run ourselves as we wish. That opportunity still remains.
That's fantastic. That's a very interesting overview from right at the heart of the machine, really. The second question I have is, what's the future of NATO, and can Europe organise its own defence and security? What's your view on that, David?
Well, I guess this is the question of the day. Europeans clearly need to take more responsibility for their own defence than they ever have before. We have spent, sort of 50, 60, 70 years really relying on the American defence shield, and there are many capabilities that America has in NATO that Europeans simply don't have and could not create quickly if we had to. Intelligence, command and control, air defence, drone defence, lots of these things simply we just don't have in Europe. And I think that's the difficulty that Europeans now face. it is absolutely correct to say that, one way or another, all Europeans need to spend much more on defence than they have done historically. That doesn't mean that the European defence effort has to be done through EU institutions. In fact, I would say one of the problems at the moment is that the EU is trying to insist on too much building of its own institutions for European defence, rather than simply focusing on how much money gets spent, which is really the crucial thing. But behind that is the reality that it's going to take 10 or 15 years to replicate the kind of capabilities that the Americans have got. And it is just, I think, a fantasy at the moment to say that we don't like President Trump, Trump is being difficult, the Atlantic Alliance is under threat, we need to defend ourselves. I don't think the Europeans can really defend themselves in that way at the moment. And we have to be realistic about it. So we need to get spending, we need to be building new defence capabilities, we need to be getting serious about this. But one important element of being serious is that we still have to make the relationship with the Americans and the Defence Alliance work properly, however frustrating it might be, because we can't defend ourselves without that.
That's very interesting. And I guess Trump also puts that into perspective as well. So, third question is European populism a danger or a corrective towards a more nation-state-based Europe? And what do you think the future of Europe in the EU is more broadly?
I think the word populism is, it means very different things to different people. And I think that's part of the difficulty with it. And the parties which are called populist in Europe are often actually rather different. They have different origins. They have to some extent different policy ideas, and kind of grouping them all under one head is, I think, a bit simplistic and unrealistic. I mean, what I do think is that in general, these so-called populist parties are a generally good reaction against a system of government in Europe that has really taken agency and power away from the ordinary voter. I mean, what I was saying earlier about Britain being able to decide most things by elections. In EU countries, you can't change a lot of things through national elections. If you want to change your trade policy, your environment policy, your agriculture policy, a lot of your economic policy, justice and home affairs, citizenship, all these kind of things, you can't decide to change them at international elections, at your national elections. You have to get others in the EU to agree, you have to get the Commission to agree, you have to get a majority in the European Parliament. It's in practice very difficult to change these things. So, in my view anyway, what's happened over time in Europe is you've got a system where national democracies have got a bit disconnected from the real centres of power, and this has produced a sense of frustration in national electorates. They can't change things, they can't get what they want, and so you get a reaction. You get these populist parties emerging, which are basically anti-system parties, and I think that's why they differ, because the sort of the characteristics of the system differ slightly country to country. But they're all parties that say we don't like the way things have been, how things have been in the last 20 years or so. We want to change that. And I think that's basically a good thing, even if many of these parties have a kind of fringe opinions that you might not agree with and don't like, and that would certainly be the case for me. But in general, I think it's a good reaction. If you build a governance system that is disconnected from national voters and national democracies, where ordinary voters can't change things, sooner or later you're going to run into problems. And I think those problems are now very evident in Europe. And my view is that those in positions of power in our governments, in Brussels, elsewhere, need to come to terms with that. It's no good trying to shut out these forces and not deal with them. You know, the Brandmauer in Germany, for example. I think this is a mistake. You have to find ways of dealing with these opinions and bring them into your national democracy, and you have to listen and, if necessary, change things. And of course, that's always the difficult bit.
Final question then. So students today are entering a world that looks less stable than the one that many of us grew up in. Where do the real opportunities lie for a young person who wants to understand and shape international affairs? And after this question, we'll open up to the audience for questions too.
Gosh, I mean, I'm the worst person to ask in many ways for this question. So, I've spent, most of my professional life in a very different world, and things are changing quite a lot, clearly, in international affairs. I think, I suppose one characteristic of, kind of modern political economic life is that it is quite international. Things which used to be purely national now have an international component. International relations are shaped by all kinds of things, businesses as well as governments, NGOs, and so on. So if you want to be involved in international affairs, I mean, the answer I would have given 20 years ago is, join your diplomatic service, join your international aid service, become a lecturer in international relations, go and join the European Commission, whatever. I don't think that you have to do that now. I think it's more, I guess my advice would be more sort of work out what you want to do, and it's probably going to have an international kind of component to it and shape it that way. I do think, broader advice, I suppose, for what it's worth. I do think it's important to have some perspective. People talk about the international system being in flux. I mean, it's always been in flux. In a way, the last 20 or 30 years are the odd time. Human affairs are always characterized by conflict and war and countries rubbing up against each other. And we're returning to the norm, I think, now, rather than entering some exceptional period. So, don't think that you've been unlucky, as it were, in starting your professional life at this time. I think it's just the way things are. Be curious, read around things, don't rely on AI, become an expert in something. I think that is going to be valuable. And I guess I would say, if you want to be involved in international affairs, try not to become an international citizen entirely. I think part of the problem we've run into in recent years is that too many of the establishment kind of ruling groups in our societies have got disconnected from their own countries. And so I guess I would say, try not to allow that to happen. Travel in bits of your own country you might not otherwise have travelled to, and get to know it properly if you can. Don't stick in your own kind of intellectual groups. Try and, come to terms with other people's opinions as well as your own. And then I think you will, find it easier to be a convincing advocate in international affairs if and when you get to that point.
Great, thank you, David. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to the audience. So if there are any questions that you may have for David to ask, please do put your hand up. And Regina?
No, it's good. Good questions. I think, the honest answer is, there are two answers really. I think the UK is the less important answer. The less important one is that the UK has been economically a bit different over the years. The UK traditions have been more free market, free trading. Our trade connections are less and less with the European Union even before we left, and much more with the rest of the world. If you look at where Brits who don't live in Britain live, they live in America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. They don't live in continental Europe by and large. So I think our international kind of connections and economy is a bit different to the EU norm, and I think that's one reason why we can kind of go it alone a bit. I think the bigger answer though is political. I don't think Britain, generally has ever felt entirely comfortable in the European Union. We haven't shared the goals. We haven't shared the ever closer union goal, for example, of the European Union. There has never been in Britain a meaningful political, strongly pro-European group. The argument that was always made for EU membership in Britain was not the EU is a great project uniting Europe, ending conflict, all those sort of things. Hardly anybody advocated that. They would all say something like, well, we're a European country, we have to be part of the EU so that we can stop things happening that might be difficult for us and generally promote our interests. There was no emotion, it was kind of practical. And I think that's at the root of it. There just wasn't enough commitment. There was a strong tradition of self-government, a somewhat different legal system in the common law, and just a sense that we didn't fit. And to most people, we just seemed to spend our time sort of blocking things and stopping making things happen in Europe. And in the end, that's what drove this. After nearly 50 years of membership, it was still not possible to persuade half the country that being a member was a good thing. And I think that kind of underlines that the project was a bit of a failure for us and needs to be rethought.
Thank you. There's another question here.
I think there are two answers to that. One, in foreign affairs, in international affairs, defence and so on, you are leaving the EU is trading sort of mass for agility, if you like. The argument for the common foreign policy, common defence policy and so on is that 27, 28 member states acting together count for more. They have a weight in the world. My counter argument to that is that the problem is they spend all their time talking to each other and not doing enough out in the world. And that for a country like the UK, which is quite big, even though it's obviously not a continental power, the ability to act quickly, to say and do things and try and lead opinion, things that are important, is more important to us. And I think, on things like the Ukraine war, where we took a very clear position early on, and I think did shape things, did shape the European reaction in a way that wouldn't have happened if we'd spent all our time in meetings in Brussels, if that had been the first reaction. So I think that ability to say what you think and say it quickly and try and get people behind you is important. And I think for us is probably more worth having than the weight generally. I mean, the bigger question, obviously, is, what is happening in international affairs? We've got Trump, we've got a growing China, we've got big powers around the world, we've got breakdown of the systems that we've got used to in the last 20 or 30 years. In the end, your ability to navigate those depends on your own power and your own economic success. Britain is never going to be a superpower. But we ought to be economically more successful than we are. We ought to have a more attractive economic model than we are. If we did, we'd have more money to spend on defence. And it is a great pity that we've allowed our defence forces to run down over these last 10 years or so. So I think in principle it's an advantage for us, but you have to put your money where your mouth is, as we say. You have to be ready to spend, you have to be ready to act, and possibly we've not been as good there as we really ought to have been.
There's one more question here.
Well, it was a mess. Those first 5 years generally were a mess. I do think the EU did behave, as you say. They obviously wanted to deter anybody else from leaving and negotiated pretty toughly with us. I don't blame them for that. The EU's got the right to determine its own interests and to implement them, and generally it did that very well. I think the problem was that for large parts of those first 5 years, we did not. The Theresa May government, which I wasn't negotiator during this period, but I think under the Theresa May government, which was 2016 to 2019, Britain was trying to have it both ways. The EU made the psychological switch very quickly that Britain is leaving. We need to extract the best terms we can and get the best deal we can. Britain was still trying to have it both ways and to have a sort of close relationship outside the EU while still going to all EU meetings and trying to be a collaborative partner. And we just never changed the mindset, I would say, in this negotiation. We kept talking about a close and special partnership. We kept hoping that the EU would do us some special deal, and it just didn't work out that way. And in fact, that time produced a lot of problems that we're still actually trying to unravel and deal with. It was only really when Boris Johnson came in, and I came in as negotiator myself, that we were able to just cut through that and say, we're not interested in any special deal. We just want a free trade agreement. We just want to be independent. We just want to go. And then things became quite simple because we were just asking for a lot less than our predecessors. But it was a major crisis. I would say it was Britain's biggest constitutional crisis for 100 years, probably. And one of the reasons why Boris and I were so determined just to come into power and just get things done, just get out, even at the price of not accepting everything that we wanted, was because we could see the whole constitution was melting down. The whole government system was beginning to break down under the pressure. And we wanted to put a stop to that and get back to normal as soon as we could. Last comment perhaps on this period is that it was very clear that most of the British establishment governing class did not want to leave the EU, thought the referendum was a terrible decision, hoped it could be, if not reversed, at least softened in some way, and some, at least of them, went out their way to make life extremely difficult, both in Parliament and elsewhere, to frustrate the result. And that difference of view amongst the British establishment is the fundamental reason why this was so difficult.
Another question?
I think the British governing class did lose the memory of how you define your own country's interests, and the habits of cooperation within the EU became very deep. You know, and I spent most of my diplomatic career really over this whole period. I joined the British Foreign Office in the late 80s and left it in 2013. And over that period, there had been a huge change in the way Britain defined its foreign policy and went about pursuing it. And at the start of it, we thought of ourselves as, really the second Western power to America, and behaved like that quite often. By the end of it, we felt that we couldn't do anything much without talking to the French and the Germans first, and generally trying to, a reflex had got established whereby we were kind of frightened to act. And I think this has sunk in quite deeply, even in areas which were never subject to EU competence in the first place, and in theory were entirely national. This kind of inability to say what's in the country's interests and how to pursue it has gone really deep, and I imagine it probably has in other EU member states if it were ever exposed in the same way. I honestly, I've come to the view that mostly, we're going to have to wait a little for a new kind of generation to come forward in Britain and, hopefully come to terms with having left the EU and focus on governing the country properly and defining our interests. And that's in domestic policy as well as international affairs. But that's going to take some time, obviously.
Any other questions?
So I don't know how closely people have been following British politics, probably not very, but really, I suppose behind your question is the reality that the EU has become an issue again in British politics in the last 2 or 3 months. The current government under Keir Starmer has been doing what it calls a reset with the EU, which is a negotiating process which is going to produce an outcome which is, in some areas I'm not keen, but I don't fundamentally object to it. In other areas, it's going to bring us back under EU law and EU institutions, obviously without any say in those laws because we're not a member. And I'm uncomfortable with that. That process is going on, but I think what it has done, together with the turbulence in the governing Labour Party, is put EU membership on the table again. And you're absolutely right to say Wes Streeting, who is one of the leading sort of politicians in Labour, is now talking about rejoining the EU. I think we are a long way from that being a realistic kind of question for Brits. As you say, I think it's really about positioning himself in the Labour Party, which never wanted to leave the EU, really, mostly. And a lot of its activists are still sort of progressives who see the EU as a good thing and want to get back closer to it. So it's about distinguishing himself. I think rejoining is still a fringe view in Britain. There's perhaps a bit more interest in some on the left in rejoining the customs union and the single market and going back in step by step. I think all this will be incredibly controversial, because one of the things that I think almost everybody in Britain agrees on is that we've kind of had enough of the Brexit wars and had enough of arguing about that from the time being. And I think gearing people up for another referendum and another argument about all these things is just going to be too much of an ask in this period. You know, who knows, in 30, 40 years, a generation maybe, but I just think it's Labour is going to find it's not a realistic policy position to take for the time being.
More questions?
Gosh, interesting question. I think it was really, during the most difficult times anyway, it's really managing our own domestic opinion. There was, the actual talks with Brussels and Michel Barnier, once we had been clear about what we wanted, were sort of painful and long, but nevertheless, I always felt we were going to reach a conclusion and get a deal. The most difficult time, as I said, was when our own system was really melting down, and we were, trying to persuade Brussels that the Boris Johnson government was stable enough and strong enough and capable of reaching an agreement that would stick, because all our predecessors, they had reached agreements which had not stuck, and we kept having to come back to them. So trying to manage that, to get a grip on our own domestic politics, to try and get enough support behind the particular approach that we'd taken and drive it through politically. And in the end, it took a general election to achieve that. That was, I think, the most difficult thing. And, there were certainly moments when I thought we weren't going to achieve it and the government might collapse again, and then who knew? So, there were high stakes. I think one of the things that characterised that time was that both the Leave side and the Remain side were playing to, win everything. The final year, all the compromise options started to disappear, and both sides were playing to kind of, win the entire bank, as it were, to use a gambling metaphor. And it could have gone either way, and the Leave side won.
Any final questions?
Well, you're right. I mean, it is a very good question. Why are things not more different in Britain after 6 years being out? And I think part of the answer is that, some things have changed, as I was saying, partly being out of certain EU things, but we have got new trade agreements, we have changed our rules in things like agriculture, we have changed environment rules, we have changed financial services rules. It's not always top of the news, but certain things have changed. But I think in general the problem was that the whole process of leaving was so traumatic for the country, and it seemed so exhausting but when we actually did it, there was this general feeling of let's just sit back in the armchair. That was just too much effort. We've done that now. Let's just coast along. And so things you mentioned, the energy to review all our laws, all our practices, start changing, start scrapping EU law, for many politicians just disappeared. And that's why things still seem quite similar to the EU. It's why I was saying at the start, it still remains in our hands to change all these things, but so far we haven't done as much as we should have. That was the whole point. There is no point in leaving the EU and then doing everything like the EU. That's the worst of both worlds. We have to do things differently.
If I may, I'll ask the final question because it hasn't really come up, and that's on Donald Trump. Now, obviously, Donald Trump is a disruptor, minimally a disruptor, and he's really seeks to sort of upend, or some would say destroy, the liberal international order. And obviously, we now have the Iran war, and he has a very skeptical attitude towards international institutions. And in many ways, he's quite hostile to liberal democracies and quite friendly with, one would say, quite sort of autocracies or non-democracies. So it's a very interesting kind of pattern now emerging in world politics with Donald Trump. And it has huge implications for Great Britain and also for the EU and world order in general. So my question to you is, what do you see the impacts of Trump are on the international system, and what will the implications of that be for Europe? I mean, it's not just the EU. Britain is a European country too, and it's a major player in economics and defence and security. So how do you see Trump as a figure in terms of the international system and world order and his implications for Europe as a whole? Not necessarily EU versus the UK, but Europe as a continent. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, it really requires a whole kind of lecture to answer that question, I guess. But I think Trump, is simply, to a large extent, I think, revealing what was always hidden in a kind of brutal, overt fashion, rather than doing something genuinely new. The so-called liberal international order only existed because the Americans backed it up and thought it was in their interests. And now, as China and other powers have grown, the international order has become more competitive, and the US are pursuing their interests in a more overt way. And he does it in a rather brutal style sometimes, but I think what he's doing is simply revealing an order that is more competitive and more challenging. I don't think he's creating one. I think he's just being more sort of obvious about it. And it's a reality, I think, that we're in a world where hard power counts for more, and bigger countries have more say about what goes on. And the only way to deal with that is to get powerful yourself and be able to engage in these balance of power politics. So I think Trump is right, obviously, to say that Europeans need to do more, relieve the burden from the Americans, get serious about their own defence affairs. I think the one interesting bit, of course, of Trump's policy is the very overt view in the national security strategy that they're supporting so-called sovereigntist forces in the EU, and the not so concealed view that they don't like the EU very much and would be quite happy to see it weaker. I don't think they're pursuing that in a very sophisticated fashion, and indeed the attacks on European countries' sovereignty over Greenland, or the kind of rubbishing of Canadian sovereignty and so on, I think just undermine it. You can't say we believe in national sovereignty, we say that the EU is a sort of false step for Europeans, and then go around rubbishing countries that are trying to maintain their own national sovereignty. So I don't think they're being particularly sort of sophisticated about the way they go about this, and they're probably hurting their own aims. But, the reality is what it is in international affairs. If you want to have some influence, you have to spend more and be more assertive and take defence and foreign policy seriously, and that means making difficult choices quite often. And the EU historically has been a power where, foreign policy process is the most important thing, following the rules, and the international system as a sort of algorithm where you put in a foreign policy problem and it kind of gives you the correct answer. And foreign policy just isn't like that. International relations aren't like that. And I think basically it's a good thing if, however ineptly and however crudely, quite often, Trump is making Europeans realise that, and we must all get serious about it, I think.
Okay, thank you so much, David. That's been a fascinating discussion with our students as well in international relations, international affairs. And I'd just like to ask the audience to give you a round of applause for your contribution to Modul. Thank you.
Thank you very much.